Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you're doing great. Uh, in this video, we'll be creating our API endpoints, all of the links that are required to access specific things in the database called endpoints, uh, encoding them in our Flask application. But before we do that, I really want to show you how endpoints work in the real world and how they're implemented in the Twitter API, which is a very popular API used by a lot of applications to access the backend of the Twitter servers. Now we will you can head over to developer.twitter.com/n/docs.html, and in this file you'll have a list of things or entities that you can work with in the Twitter API ecosystem. Now the most common thing that we can work with is the tweets object. So we'll click on the tweets object, and you can see that it already provides a list of different things you can do with the tweet object. So the basic stuff, which is post, retrieve and engage with tweets, is what we want to look at. So we will click on this link, and once we click on this link, we have a list of different what we call endpoints here. Like you can see in this description, they have written the following API endpoints can be used to programmatically create, retrieve and delete tweets, retweets and likes, which is basically with accessing the backend of the Twitter server. Now if we go to if you head over to the API reference tab, we will have the specific we'll have specification for each endpoint, and in this endpoint specification I want to show you something very important. Resource URL is mentioned, which basically means that you need to access this resource or visit this resource, which is api.twitter.com/1.1/statuses/update to access this resource if you want to create, which means post, you want to send a post request to statuses/update. So you want to visit http this URL and with a post http header, so that you are able to create a new tweet. Now if you wanted to get all the tweets, you will just go to any of the get requests. Let's say we want to see a specific tweet, so we will click on this endpoint, and you can see that we have our resource URL is this api.twitter.com/statuses/show.json. So you are able to understand how endpoints work in our case, and how endpoint works in the Twitter API case, and how they're going to translate into ours. Now they have a very extensive API because they do a lot of stuff with their database, but compared to that, we will have a very simple API, and we'll have a much smaller list of endpoints to handle. So let's head over to our code and let's comment out the endpoints that we will require. To create the blueprint of the endpoint, you need to follow this convention. Type in the HTTP method, which can be anything from get, post, put, patch, any of that, and type that in capital letters, and then we want to retrieve a list of task lists. So our endpoint will look something like this: task lists, and that's it. So whenever we visit our website dash task lists, we will return a list of task lists. Another thing we want to do with our API is create a new task list. And to create something new, we send a post request. So capital post space task lists. That's how you create this endpoint. The next endpoint we want to work with is to get a list of tasks. To do that, we'll just send a get request slash tasks. Another endpoint we want to work with is required when we create a new task, and that is post slash tasks, sending a post request to the tasks endpoint. Now the last route or endpoint we want to work with is when we need to update the status of the task, which can be set to complete or incomplete. And to do that, we'll send in a put request. You can also send in a patch request, but I recommend you use a put request because most of the editing or updating of a certain resource is done through a put request. So we will use a put request and space tasks, but in this case we will type in an ID of the task, which the ID of the task that we want to uh, update the status of. So the our URL will look somewhat like this: space slash tasks slash, let's say, 2. So the task with ID 2 will be updated in this case. So now that we have a list of comments that tell us what we'll be doing, we start working and creating our endpoints. But before we do all of that, we need to create these tables, these two database model tables in our Postgres database. And to do that, we will type in our main function, we will type in db dot create all. So whenever the app is running, it creates the tables if they don't already exist in the database. So we will hit save, and then it reloads our application. We will just make sure and reload it again. Yes, it reloads our application, and to check whether it created all the tables we required in our database, we will open the Postgres terminal, and in the Postgres terminal we'll enter the to-do list database because we're using that. And in the to-do list we'll type in trailing slash d, that will list all the tables in this database. So you can see we have a task list table and we have a tasks table. So you don't need to worry about these sequences here because there's something Postgres requires to maintain these tables, but we have a task list table and a tasks table. So we were successful in creating our database. So I'll close this and start working with our endpoint. So the first endpoint is going to be a route that will indicate slash task lists. So as you remember, we created a route here that indicates the base route. In this case we'll create another route, but this will be app.route. In quotes we'll have slash task lists, and by default the method that this route will have is get, so we don't need to specify the method here. This route will wrap in a response function which we will call get task lists, and this will get fired every time we visit the slash task list endpoint. So I'll just to check whether this is working, we'll type in returning task lists and hit save, and then visit slash task lists localhost slash localhost colon 5000 slash task lists, press enter. So you can see that it prints out the string returning task list which we want. Now we would ideally want to return a JSON object, which is basically an object in JavaScript, and to do that we'll type in JSONify. So we will return JSONify the function, and then we will type in the attributes we want to return. So let's say we want to return the message, a message in whenever this endpoint is visited. So message, and in this message we'll type in this endpoint returns task lists and hit save, and then we will refresh this page, and then you can see that this yeah, I'm sorry, I had a typo here. And once I refresh, you can see that it's instead of returning a normal string, it is returning a JavaScript object. So that now that we have that under working, the next thing we want to do is actually return a list of task lists. And to do that, we'll need to query the database and get a list of all the task lists that are contained in the database. And because we have imported SQL Alchemy, it is extremely easy to do that. So let's call our variable where we'll store all the task lists called task lists equal to, then we'll type in the name of the data model that we want to query. So in this case that is task list, and we will type in dot query, which is a function to query this table in the database, and dot all, which means that we will query all of the task list entities in the task lists object, and we will print out task list to see how it looks. So we will do that, and once we hit save and revisit this endpoint, it will still return the same thing because we are still returning the message. This endpoint returns task list, but when we go to our terminal, we can see that it returns an empty list, which is because we really haven't created a task list yet. So we'll get to that. So instead of printing task lists, we'll return a list of all the task lists. and we will assign the task lists object that we have just created, so task lists. And if we hit save and refresh, we get an empty array. we are really we are going to run into an error later on, but I want us to run into that error because I want to teach you how to serialize objects. So we will leave this here. The next endpoint that we want to handle is to create a new task list, and this is also very simple thing to do. Now we'll create a new route, app.route, and this will be also task lists. But in this case, the method is not get and it is post, and to specify any method that is not get, we need to pass in the methods list in this route initialization. So in this methods list, I will add in post, so it knows that whenever this task list endpoint is uh, visited via the post http method, it needs to use the response function called create task list, and that's there. Now we will return another JSONify object over here and type in message. This endpoint is used to create a new task list. Because browser makes all the requests with get, I cannot use the browser to visit this URL, and we will use the application called Postman, which is POST. If you would have installed that, it will be in your computer. And when Postman opens up, we need to create a new request, so we will type in post and then visit our URL which is http localhost colon 5000 task lists, and then press send. So it will send a post request to this URL, and you can see that we get a message in return, which is this endpoint is used to create a new task list. Now we need to actually send some data to this endpoint, which is the name of the task list, so that we are able to create a new task list. And we can do that using a body, adding a body to this request using the raw function, because we want to define a raw JavaScript object and to do and use the type as JSON application slash JSON. So which means we're creating a JavaScript object, and to create a JavaScript object we'll create curly braces. We will type in curly braces, and this object is contained inside this curly braces. The only thing we need to pass in this object is the name, so we will type in quotes name and colon the name of the task list we want to create. So let's say work, and I will hit send. Now this response is the same, that this endpoint is used to create a new task list, but a new task list has not actually been created because we haven't handled the data that we are getting from the request. To do that, we need to assign a data variable, which is data is equal to request dot get JSON, and that converts the data into a JSON object, or that convert in this case it converts the JSON object that we're receiving from the request into a Python dictionary. So the next thing we want to do is print out the data to see how we can work with it and how it looks. So we will print out the data and we'll send it another request with the same thing, name work. It returns the same response because we haven't changed what the response is, but once we open our terminal application, we see that it is passing JavaScript object with the name is equal to work. So now we want to work with this JavaScript object, and in this case a Python dictionary. So to access the name attribute of this dictionary, we will type in square brackets and the name of the key, which is basically name. So let's say name, and we will save and send another post request. And if we see the terminal, it returns work. So we can work with this string to create a new task list. To create a new task list, we simply instantiate a new Python object for that specific class that we want to create an object for. So because we want to create an object for the task list class, we need to create an object called task list is equal to the name of the class. task list, and open brackets close brackets, which means we are creating a new task list object. But because the init function of the task list object takes the name attribute, we need to pass in the name in its instantiation. So we will pass in name, data name, which is the name we received from the request. Now a new task list object has been created, but we need to save this in the database. And to do that, we'll use the db object that we have instantiated before and use db.session.add, and we will add the task list object. Then we need to commit the changes we made to the session. So db.session.commit. Now we will hit save and make the same request this time and send. Now we get the same message, but if we make a request, if we make a get request to localhost 5000 slash task lists send, you see we are getting into an error, and I wanted us to run into this error because I wanted to show you that the object that we are receiving is a query object and it is not serializable as a JSON object, which means that it cannot be represented as a JSON object. But in this case we are forcing it to get represented as a JSON object, passing it into the JSONify function. Now to make it JSON serializable, we'll create a new dictionary for each task list object and add it to a list. So let's say we name it task list underscore list, which is a list of task lists equal to an empty list right now, and we will query over all the results we get from the task list query, this dot query dot all. So which means for I in task lists, which is the original query, we will create a new dictionary. Let's say TL equals to, let's say TL equals to an empty dictionary. Now we will assign the keys to this dictionary according to the object of the task list. And because the task list object only has a key, an attribute called name, we will assign the name key of the TL dictionary to the I to the at the name attribute of this specific task list object. And once that is done, we will push in the name. We will push this TL object into the task list. This we push the TL object into the task list. So it can be TL dot append. Sorry, task lists list dot append TL. That creates the list of task lists. So now we return the task list and save this. So if we visit the get request, if we resend the get request, now we receive a list of task list. One is with name work, and there's no other task list because we only created one yet. Also, one thing we're missing is the returning the ID of the task list, because that is required by the task object to associate to a specific task list. And to add a new attribute to this response, it's very simple. Because the IA object also contains an ID attribute, we will assign the ID key of the TL dictionary as I.id, and then I'll hit save, and then I will send the get request again. Now you can see that I am getting returned the ID and work together. And just to test whether we are able to return multiple task lists, we'll create another task list called home, let's say, and send this request. Now if I visit the get request again, you see that we have two task lists created now, because we were able to successfully manage the post request and successfully serialize our objects into a JSON list. Now that's done. We have successfully created two endpoints: the task lists endpoint to create a new to get all the task lists, and the post task lists endpoint to create a new task list. Alright, the next thing we want to work with is getting a list of tasks, and in this case we would want a list of tasks for a specific task list. So we will create uh, another route, app.route, name this route slash tasks, and method is get by default, so we don't need to define the method here, and the handler function will be called get tasks. In this case, the request that we need to handle the retrieving of tasks for a specific task list, so we will pass that as a query parameter, and that is basically a question mark followed by the name of the attribute, let's say list id equals to whatever number, but you don't need to define this in this URL specification. We will just access that list ID through the request object that we have imported using Flask. So I will type in list ID is equal to request dot args dot get, and the name of the query parameter, which is list ID. And for simplicity right now we will just return the list ID. And to show you what I mean, I will save this and visit this endpoint tasks. Now because I haven't added any list ID yet, I will just press enter, and the view it'll say that the view function didn't return anything, and that is because we are forcing it to return a list ID, but we haven't really passed list ID in the URL. To do that, we will just type in question mark list ID equals to, let's say, 1. So we will pass in that and it returns 1. Now it doesn't really know what list ID, the type of list ID is, so we can type in anything and it will return that. So type in your name over here and it will return your name. But we need to pass an integer, so we'll just pass another integer and see that it changes that. So it's able to handle this query here and return the number over here. So we need to handle this number and return a task list, a list of tasks that are contained in a specific task list with ID mentioned over here. So to do that, we will use the list ID and then we'll query the tasks object. To do that, we will type in tasks equal to task dot query dot filter by this, because we want to filter by the list ID. So filter by list ID equals to list ID that we have just extracted from our URL. So this gets a list of query objects and associates it to an object called tasks. Now again, if I return the JSON version of this, it will give us the same error, which is task equals to task, and the error that we are going to receive is that global name task is not defined. Sorry, there was a typo. And the error that we're going to receive is that this query object is not JSON serializable, which we were anticipating already. So to make it JSON serializable, we'll do the same thing again. And to serialize this, again we'll type in another for function, which is for I in tasks. We create a new task dictionary, we can name it T, and create an empty dictionary with it, and assign the keys of this task, which can be the text, which will be I dot text, then the ID, which will be I dot ID. The next thing we'll have is the completed property, which is going to be I dot completed, and the last thing we have is the list id property, which is equal to I dot list id, and add this t dictionary to the tasks list list, which is basically task list. We will create a new empty list and then assign this t inside the task list. So that will be task list dot append and t. And in the JSONify function, instead of returning the tasks query object, we will return the task list. And now we reload this and it returns an empty array. So to do that, we will update our last endpoint, which is our second last endpoint, which is the post task endpoint, and this route will be the same as the previous one. So app dot route tasks / tasks, and the method should be post in this case, because we'll be creating a new task, and the handler function will be named create task. Now the create task function will take in a JSON object as request. So we'll create a new post request in Postman, that will be http colon / localhost colon 5000 / tasks, and in this we will send a raw JSON object which will have a few properties. The first property will be the name, sorry, the text, take dog for a walk. The next thing will be the list ID, which is the ID of the list. That can be any number, so we will type in 1. These are the only true properties we need to pass in this JSON object, because the completed property would be set to false by default when we create the task object, and the list ID and the ID is inferred, so we don't really need to pass anything else. These are the two properties we need to pass in the tasks post request. So now that we are sending this post request, we will handle this post request in this post route. So we will assign a data variable to the request JSON object. So request.getJSON. So that assigns the JSON we're getting in the request to the data dictionary in Python. So we will print out data again to see what's happening and return a simple JSONify message or a JSON message. This endpoint creates a task. Now we will send this post request and we get the message that this endpoint creates a task. If we see our output in the terminal, we can see that we have a JSON object here that we can handle to create a new task. To do that, it's very simple. We will extract the text from the data object. So text is equal to data and key of text. The list ID is equal to data with a key of list ID, and we need both of these to create a new task object for the init function of the task object. If you remember, the init function of the task object takes two things, the text and the list ID. So to create a new task object, we name it task equals to the name of the class task, and inside the brackets we pass in the attributes we need to create the task with. So the text and the list ID. I think that's the order. Yeah, so the text and the list ID we will pass that into the task object, and once that is done, uh, we will add this object to the database session. So we will do db session add and add the object which is task. And the last thing is we want to commit changes to the database, so we will commit, and this will add the new task to our tasks database. And once that is done, we need to return a much more helpful message. Let's say we'll return the message task created successfully. And one more thing that you can do with Flask is you can return HTTP codes, the type of result we have received from the action that we have done. So in this case, we have created something like we have created an entity, and to return whether we have, and to indicate that the entity is created, we return an HTTP response code 201. We will save that, and we will visit our post request again and send this request. Now, sorry, I had a typo over here. We commit this session and not the database object itself. We will save that, and then we will send the post request again. Now it sends a message task created successfully, and the status is 201 created. Now if I get a list of tasks for a specific task list, I can do that by using a get request, and that is http colon localhost 5000 space tasks, and in the query we will pass in the list id equals to 1, and we will send this request, we will send this get request, and you can see that we already received a list of tasks, and they are represented by JavaScript objects. The first one is the take dog for a walk with the list id of 1 and id of 1. So we can see this queries according to the list id that we pass in the urls. For example, I pass in 2 and I haven't created any task to the task list 2, it returns an empty list. So I will query it according to 1. So to check whether multiple task lists are getting displayed correctly, we will create a new task list. For that task, we will create a new task, and for that we will visit the post endpoint that we just created, and we will send a new request and create a new task. So let's say our task is cook food, and we will add this to the same list. So we will send this request, it sends us a 201 created status message, and once we query the tasks again, we will see that now we have two tasks in this task list, the cook food task and the take dog for a walk task, and you can see that the id has automatically been updated. The first was 1 and the second was 2. Now we want to work with the last uh, route that we want to work is will be used to update the status of the task. And to make things simple, we will update it to the opposite of the current status. So let's say if a task in the database has a completed set to true, when once we send a put request for that task id, we should be able to reset it to false. So we will type in def update, we will we will create a new route, app dot route, and we will pass in tasks. And to pass in to variable in this url, we will enclose it inside angular braces and type in the name of variable. So for our case it is id, so we will type in id, and the method we will use to handle it will be a put method. The function that we will use to handle this request, it will be named update task, and it will take the id that we had passed from the url. So this id will be passed in this function. To get the to update the task, we first need to get the task from the specific task from the database, and to do that we need to query the task list, the tasks table, filter by the id that we have received here, and use the first result. So we will use a task equals to name of the class task dot query filter by id equals to the id that we have received in this function, and we will just return this task for now to see what happens. So we will save, and then we will create a new request, which is basically a put request to http colon slash slash localhost 5000 tasks, and let's say we'll pass an id of 1 and pass and send this put request to see what happens. It does not get any response, but yeah, I think that is because of the error that we have received here. The init function got an unexpected keyword method. So we have uh, named it wrongly. It should be methods, not method. And then we will save this and run our server again. Yes, it runs, so that means it was solved. And then we will send this request. Now, instead of returning the task, we will print the task that we have just queried and return a simple JSONify message and set it to this endpoint updates tasks. So we will save that and send the request again. We get the message that this endpoint updates tasks. So to see what was uh, printed, what we were able to query, we can see that this has a query, SQL query written over here, which was exactly what the task object is right now. So that is task ID as task ID, and this is, you don't need to worry about this because we only need to use the first uh, the result of this query. So we will type in first method and hit save, and then we will send this request again, and now that we see what's been printed, it returns task 1. So it returns an object of task that we are able to retrieve from the database. So now that we have received that, we will type in task.text to see whether it is able to print the text of the task. We will send this request again, and we see that it prints out takes dog for a walk. So we were able to retrieve the correct task object over here, so we'd want to work with that. To do that, we will simply set task dot completed, which is the completed function, to not task dot completed, which basically means that if the task had a completed status of true, it will be set to false, and if it had false, it will be set to true. So we will then add this to the database session. So db session add task, and then commit this to the commit these changes, db session commit. And once that is done, we need to return a more useful message such that task was updated. Alright, so to see how the changes will work, I will first show you the list of tasks here. So in this case, the list with the task with id 1 has a completed property of false, but once we visit this endpoint again, the put endpoint, we will be able to update the task with id 1 and set it to true. So we will send this request. Yes, you need to change this line. We added a function before, but it's actually an assignment. So we are assigning the completed property of the task to something that it's not. So we will save this and then send this request again, and you can see we have a 200 OK response, and our messages task was updated. Now we will query the list of tasks and send this task again. Now you see that the task with id 1 has a completed attribute of true. So we were able to successfully get the specific task and update its status. If I send this again, if I send this put request again, It will tell me that the task was updated, and again the task with ID 1 becomes false. So the completed again becomes false. So that's that for this API video. We were able to create an API from scratch in this one, and you were able to understand a few things such as endpoints, HTTP methods, response codes. If you want to learn about these things in detail, I will link resources to them in this lesson. Other than that, our backend is completely ready. The next video lesson, we will be connecting our front end to the backend and seeing how that works. So see you in the next lesson.